If you think about the evolution of a mirror, it actually tells you an incredible amount about human history.
Okay, I can see where you might be going with this, but how so, specifically?
Well, think about the physical object itself. Sometimes a mirror is just, this beautifully polished glass, right?
Right.
It's designed to reflect a perfect, orderly, idealized version of who we want to be.
Right.
But then, depending on the era, it acts more like a magnifying glass.
Oh, like focusing the light.
Exactly. You hold it up to the sun, and it focuses the light so intensely that it actually burns a hole right through societal flaws.
Mm.
And then there are times when it's a funhouse mirror. It's distorted, it's shattered, it's mocking you, and it's basically showing us our own completely fragmented psychology.
I love that. That framing actually perfectly captures the technological journey we are exploring today because, well, we aren't talking about the history of glass and silver backing.
Right, definitely not.
We are looking at the history of the stage, and the stage is, it is the ultimate malleable technology for reflecting humanity.
It really is. And welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we are taking you on a massive, sweeping journey.
Which is a big one.
Huge. We want to look at the history of drama, not just as a dusty timeline of old scripts, but as a comparative study. We're looking at how human identity and society itself has been mirrored on the stage over centuries.
And we are pulling from a towering stack of definitive texts for this. Volumes on modern drama, Renaissance drama, and the heavy theoretical stuff about the tension between poetry and performance.
Yeah, so we are going to trace how we went from the Renaissance idea that all the world's a stage to the really grim, hyper-realistic kitchen sink dramas of the 20th century.
And finally into the fragmented, chaotic, and sometimes just deckly cynical postmodern plays of the modern era.
Right. So where do we start?
Well, the core thing to keep in mind for you, the listener, as we trace this evolution, is that drama isn't just words on a page, it's a living, breathing mechanism.
A technology, like you said.
Exactly. Playwrights don't just write dialogue, they engineer social laboratories. And the design of those laboratories completely changes depending on what society is terrified of or obsessed with at any given moment.
So let's go back to that first mirror then, the Renaissance.
Yes.
When we hear the phrase, all the world's a stage, we immediately think of Shakespeare. It's Locke's from As You Like It.
Of course.
But to fully grasp this, we really have to understand what the world actually looked and felt like back then. That phrase wasn't just a clever poetic metaphor. It was a daily, lived reality.
It really was. In the Renaissance, life was viewed as a continuous mandatory performance.
Mandatory.
Yeah, people played distinct, highly codified roles, and there was no real concept of escaping your character. You had the church, the court, the grammar schools.
Wait, the grammar schools, how does that fit in?
Well, the educational system was literally built on theater. Young boys were learning Latin not by quietly reading textbooks at desks.
Which sounds incredibly boring anyway.
Right. Instead, they were acting out the ancient comedies of Plautus and the bloody tragedies of Seneca.
Oh, wow. So they were physically doing it.
Exactly. To be educated in the Renaissance was to learn how to perform a role, to debate as different historical characters, to physically embody rhetoric. You were always on a stage.
I want to pause and just picture this. If I'm walking through London in, say, the late 1500s, what is the sensory experience of this?
Oh, it's overwhelming.
Because we think of theater today as a very polite, sit in the dark and cough quietly experience. But the Globe Theater wasn't like that at all, was it?
Not even slightly. Going to a public playhouse like the Globe was a raucous, smelly, totally visceral experience. You had thousands of people crammed together.
Just shoulder to shoulder.
Yeah, and the groundlings who paid a penny were standing in the dirt pit right up against the stage. They were drinking, eating nuts, actively shouting at the actors.
While the wealthy people are, sitting safely away?
The wealthy were up in the galleries in all their finery, looking down on it all, and the stage itself was thrust right out into the audience in the broad daylight.
Right. No stage lights to separate them.
Exactly. The boundary between the theater and real life was incredibly porous. An actor delivering a soliloquy was looking right into the eyes of a blacksmith or a nobleman.
So the bleeding of boundaries was physical, but it was also thematic, right?
Very much so.
Which brings us to a genre that emerged during this time called domestic tragedy. And there's a prime example of this that I want us to really dig into, a play from 1592 called Arden of Faversham.
Oh, that's a wild one.
And this is based on a true story, isn't it?
It is based on a notorious real-life murder that happened in 1551. It's the story of a woman, Alice Arden, who conspires with her lover, who is a lower-class tailor named Mosby, to murder her wealthy landowner husband, Thomas Arden.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to a modern listener, that just sounds like a standard Dateline episode.
Right, a classic true crime setup.
Yeah. A spouse gets murdered for a lover and some money. It's terrible, it's a crime, but it's a private domestic crime. Why would this warrant an entire new genre of high tragedy?
Well, this is where we have to completely shift our modern perspective and look through the Renaissance lens. At that time, the household was viewed as a literal microcosm of the state.
Okay, a microcosm of the state.
Yes. The husband was the king of his castle. And I don't mean that as a cute saying. I mean legally and philosophically, the husband represented the monarch, and the wife, children, and servants were his subjects.
Wow.
So the murder of a husband by a wife wasn't just categorized in the law books as murder. It was legally defined as petty treason.
Petty treason. Because she isn't just killing a guy she doesn't like. She is literally overthrowing the sovereign of her domestic realm.
You've hit the nail on the head. The boundaries between the private home and the public state were entirely blurred. A threat to the patriarch of a family was symbolically and legally a threat to the monarch of the country.
Because if the micro-kingdom falls, the macro-kingdom is next.
Exactly. If the wife could overthrow her husband, what was stopping the citizens from overthrowing the queen?
So when the groundlings and the nobles are watching Arden of Faversham, they aren't just watching a domestic squabble, they're watching a political assassination.
Yes, exactly. And the play itself is fascinating because Alice and Mosby are incredibly incompetent murderers.
They are.
Oh, totally. They hire hitmen, they try poison broth, they try ambushing him on a dark road. It takes them multiple bungled attempts before they finally manage to kill him while he's playing backgammon in his own house.
Jeez. That's almost darkly comedic.
It is, but the slow, creeping dread of the play isn't just about whether they will get caught. It's about the terrifying breakdown of social order.
Right.
And this categorization of Marudicides' wives killing husbands as petty treason wasn't some archaic rhetorical flourish that faded quickly.
Right.
It remained on the books in English law until the statute of treasons was finally abolished in 1828.
Wait, 1828? That is astonishing.
Yeah.
That's what, the 19th century?
Yep.
It took that long to untangle the private home from the political state.
But I have a question about the audience for these plays. Were these Renaissance domestic tragedies essentially the true crime podcasts of their day?
In a way, yes.
Because Thomas Arden was a wealthy landowner, they weren't writing plays about, peasants killing peasants.
Yeah.
Was this just a way for the middle class to voyeuristically consume upper-class scandal, the way we watch documentaries about billionaires behaving badly?
There is absolutely a voyeuristic element to it. This period saw the rise of the middling sorts. Wealthy merchants, lawyers, landowners who weren't born nobility but had amassed significant power and property.
Like the new money crowd.
Right. Domestic tragedy allowed this emerging middle class to see their own environments, their own households, elevated to the realm of high tragedy. Previously, tragedy was reserved exclusively for kings, emperors, and mythological heroes.
So having a wealthy landowner as the tragic victim was validating them.
Yes, it was a way of validating the importance of this new social class. They were seeing themselves in the mirror for the first time, albeit a very bloody mirror.
Exactly.
But the public playhouse wasn't the only way drama was consumed back then, right? The sources talk about a completely different tradition happening simultaneously called closet drama.
Yes.
Which sounds like hiding in a wardrobe to put on a play, but it's actually something else entirely.
It is. Closet dramas were plays meant to be read, not performed. They were written to be circulated among the intellectual elite.
Like who?
Specifically groups like the Sidney Circle, centered around Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke, in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. For them, reading a play privately was a way to blend politics, poetics, and piety.
But why not just put it on a stage? I mean, if you write a great play, don't you want the masses to see it?
Not if you want to keep your head attached to your neck.
Ah, good point.
The public stage was heavily censored by the Master of the Revels. If you put on a play at the Globe that questioned the divine right of kings, you could be imprisoned or worse.
Right, because of that whole petty treason, threat to the state mindset we just talked about.
Exactly. But if you're passing a manuscript around a private circle of highly educated friends, it becomes a safe space.
A safe space for reformist thinkers to explore dangerous political theories, I bet.
Yes, things like limited monarchy, popular sovereignty, and religious reform. It was the Renaissance equivalent of a private, encrypted group chat.
That makes perfect sense. So If you're putting on a play in public, you have to be careful. But even on the public stage, you had playwrights who were pushing the envelope. Humanist playwrights like Ben Jonson and John Marston.
The humanists were playing incredibly complex games with their public audiences. Their goal wasn't necessarily to moralize or to push a specific political campaign.
What were they trying to do then?
Their goal was to tease the audience, to challenge rigid, monolithic views. They wanted to force the audience to confront paradoxes and moral dilemmas that couldn't be easily resolved by simply pointing to the Bible or the law.
I'm trying to picture how a playwright actually does this without just getting booed off the stage.
Right.
How do you tease an audience into confronting a paradox?
Let's look at a common Renaissance trope that the humanists love to play with: the unnatural marriage.
Okay.
You see this in John Marston's play, The Faun. The setup is a classic comedic trope. You have an elderly, wealthy husband of 65 who is marrying a young girl of 15.
Yikes. Yeah.
In Renaissance thought, there was a deep underlying anxiety about the conflict between nature and enforcement.
Can you define those terms for me in this context? What is nature and what is enforcement?
So, nature dictates the biological and emotional reality of human beings. Nature says that lovers should be of similar ages, driven by mutual attraction and vitality.
Right.
An old man and a young girl is a relationship built entirely on enforcement, which means societal rules, financial contracts, property rights, and parental dictates. It is a marriage enforced by law, not by nature.
It's an arrangement, a business transaction disguised as a sacrament.
Exactly. And Marston puts this on stage not just so the audience can laugh at the foolish old man, though that is part of the comedy. He does it to force the audience to examine their own societal structures.
Oh, so he's holding up the mirror again.
Yes. The audience laughs, but then they have to go home and look at their own arranged marriages. Are our laws and our marriages actually aligned with nature, or are they scandalous, miserable enforcements that we just pretend are normal?
So he's not telling them what to think, he's just planting the bug.
Right. The humanists didn't wrap the play up with a neat bow giving you the answer. They gave you the uncomfortable question to chew on.
Wow. So the Renaissance saw the world as a stage where everyone played a role, and the playwrights were essentially testing the script. But then history moves forward. We hit the 18th and 19th centuries, and society decides to put down the script entirely and instead hold a magnifying glass up to the very grim reality of what was happening behind the curtain.
We enter the era of modernity, and the transition is chaotic. The first major shift is a massive rejection of the past, specifically the rejection of classicism.
Okay, here we go.
This is historically referred to as the querelle des anciens et des modernes, the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns.
I love a good historical quarrel. Who were they and what were they fighting about?
The ancients were the 17th century French neoclassicists. These were writers and critics who believed that for a play to be good, it had to follow a very strict, rigid set of rules known as the unities of time, place, and action.
The unities.
Yeah. And they claimed, falsely, that these rules came directly from Aristotle's Poetics.
What were the unities, practically speaking? Like, how did they limit a writer?
Well, unity of time meant the entire plot of the play had to happen within 24 hours.
In real time? Or just the plot?
The plot had to span no more than a day. Unity of place meant the play could only happen in one single physical location, and unity of action meant there could only be one main plot line, with zero subplots or distractions.
That sounds incredibly suffocating.
Yeah.
You could never have a sprawling epic like Game of Thrones or even Hamlet under those rules.
It was suffocating. And eventually, the moderns rebelled. They argued that human experience doesn't happen in a single room over 24 hours. They said these rules were artificial constraints that strangled creativity and prevented the stage from reflecting the true complexity of life.
And this rebellion leads us directly into the Romantic shift of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, which is actually where my mirror metaphor from the beginning comes from.
Oh, right.
Yeah, one of the definitive texts we are looking at notes that during the Romantic period, the artist moved from holding up a mirror to reality, to being a lamp, illuminating inner self-expression and subjectivity.
That mirror-to-lamp shift is a profound philosophical earthquake, and it was heavily influenced by philosophers like Immanuel Kant.
Okay, I need an ELI 5 explain. Like, I'm 5 on Immanuel Kant's influence here. How does an 18th century Prussian philosopher change how a playwright writes a scene?
In the simplest terms, before Kant, the general belief was that reality is something out there, and the human mind just passively observes it. The artist's job was to act as a mirror, reflecting the out there as accurately as possible.
Okay, makes sense.
But Kant came along and flipped that. He argued that the human mind actively shapes reality. Our perceptions, our emotions, our inner subjectivity, these things construct the world we experience.
So reality isn't objective. Reality is filtered through me.
Right. And for the Romantic artist, this was a revelation. If the mind shapes reality, then the artist's inner world, their emotions, their individual genius, is the most important thing to capture.
Ah, so they become the lamp.
Exactly. The artist becomes a lamp radiating their unique subjective inner light outward onto the world. You get plays filled with moody heroes, supernatural elements, vast untamed nature, and intense personal emotion.
But, as with all artistic movements, if you swing the pendulum too far in one direction, it's going to come crashing back. If you're a starving worker in a factory during the Industrial Revolution, someone shining a lamp of inner self-expression at you isn't exactly going to put food on the table.
And this is where the backlash begins. Enter the young Hegelians and the birth of realism.
Hold on, before we get to starving workers who are the young Hegelians, that sounds like a 19th century boy band.
They do sound like a boy band, don't they? They were actually a group of radical intellectuals in Germany. To understand them, you just need a tiny bit of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel.
Okay, lay it on me.
Hegel was a massive philosopher who believed that history was driven by the progression of absolute ideas and spirit. The young Hegelians, which included a young Karl Marx, took Hegel's dialectical method but completely rejected his focus on abstract ideas.
They flipped him upside down.
Yes, they argued that history isn't driven by spiritual ideas. It is driven by material reality, economics, class struggle, the physical conditions of the world.
So they looked at the Romantic playwrights, agonizing over their inner emotions, and said, wake up, people are dying in the streets.
Exactly. Driven by the horrors of the Industrial Revolution, the slums, the child labor, the urban squalor, realism demanded an objective look at the gritty material world.
Right.
They argued that Romanticism was an elitist evasion of social reality. Realism said, we need to look objectively at the ugly, hard facts of how people are actually living, and we need to put that on the stage.
And a perfect, heartbreaking example of this from the material we reviewed is the reaction of the famous social activist Emma Goldman. She reacted to a play called The Weavers by Gerhard Hauptmann.
That's such a powerful example.
It really is. Hauptmann wrote a play set in 1844 about a group of Silesian weavers who were starving to death, and Goldman points out a specific scene that encapsulates this new realism. There is a scene where these exhausted, starving weavers bring their finished cloth to the office of their rich employer, and nothing dramatic happens. They don't give a grand speech, they don't fight a duel, they are just kept waiting for hours, entirely at the pleasure of their employer, who is busy eating a lavish meal in the next room.
Goldman recognized how uniquely cruel and realistic that scene was. It wasn't about a hero slaying a dragon. It was about the crushing, banal cruelty of class disparity.
Yeah, the violence isn't a sword fight.
Right. The violence is the waiting. The violence is the economic power dynamic. Realism wanted to strip away the facades and show the causal networks beneath appearances.
But here is the massive problem with realism, just from a practical standpoint. If I go to the theater and you just show me starving people waiting in an office for 3 hours, I'm going to leave. To keep an audience engaged while showing them the grim reality of life, you need a very strong, entertaining structure to hold the medicine.
You need a delivery mechanism. And, ironically, the structure that the great radical realists used was invented by a playwright who was anything but a radical, a French writer named Augustin Eugene Scribe.
Ah, Scribe. The man who basically invented the algorithm for a hit play. The records say he wrote or co-wrote 374 works. How does a human being physically produce 374 plays?
You do it by perfecting a mathematical, foolproof formula. He invented what became known as the pièce bien faite, the well-made play. It was basically an assembly line structure for dramatic writing.
Okay, I want to understand how this formula works. Walk me through the steps of a well-made play.
Scribe's formula essentially has 5 key components. First, careful exposition. You establish secrets that are known only to the audience and a few characters.
Okay, so we're hooked.
Second, you have a central misunderstanding or a withheld piece of information that drives the plot. Third, you engineer a perfectly timed series of ups and downs in the hero's fortunes, the rising and falling action.
Standard pace.
Fourth, and most importantly, you have the scene affair, the obligatory scene, where the hero reaches their absolute highest or lowest point and the secret is finally revealed. And fifth, A totally logical, credible climax where all loose ends are tied up and moral order is restored.
Wait, that formula sounds exactly like a modern blockbuster movie.
It really does.
If you take a Marvel Cinematic Universe movie, like the first Iron Man or the Avengers, it maps perfectly onto Scribe's formula from the 1800s. You have the secret technology, the rising and falling action, the obligatory scene where the hero faces the villain and everything looks lost, and then the climax where the villain is defeated and moral order is restored. It's totally predictable.
It is incredibly predictable, but it is also psychologically irresistible. Human beings love seeing patterns completed.
So I have to ask you, if the formula is so safe, so predictable, and so designed to restore moral order and make the audience feel good, why did it become the ultimate Trojan horse for revolutionary pessimistic thinkers? How did playwrights like Henrik Ibsen, Anton Chekhov, and August Strindberg use something so formulaic to tear society apart?
Because they hijacked it. They used the audience's psychological addiction to scribe structure against them. They took that comfortable, expected framework and they injected it with a radical, unresolved moral ambiguity.
They lured the audience in with the promise of a neat Marvel movie resolution and then just pulled the rug out.
Let's look at Ibsen's masterpiece, A Doll's House from 1879. The audience sits down expecting a standard melodrama. The play introduces Nora, a seemingly frivolous, happy bourgeois wife, and her patronizing husband, Torvald.
Very standard setup.
Then Ibsen employs all the mechanics of the well-made play. There is a secret. Nora forged a signature to borrow money to save her husband's life years ago. There is a villain threatening to reveal the secret. There are letters hidden in mailboxes. There is rising tension.
It's all the Scribian gears turning perfectly.
But then we hit the climax. The secret is revealed. Torvald finds out. The audience leans in, expecting the standard scribe resolution.
Right, where Torvald forgives her, the villain is banished, and they live happily ever after.
Exactly. Moral order restored.
But Ibsen doesn't do that.
No, Torvald erupts. He calls her a hypocrite, a liar, a criminal, and says she is unfit to raise their children. He reveals himself to be a coward who only cares about his public reputation, not her sacrifice.
Ouch.
And then a miraculous thing happens. The villain decides to drop the blackmail. The threat is gone. Torvald instantly switches gears, says, I am saved, and tries to return to normal. He literally says, we can go back to how things were.
He assumes the well-made play is back on track.
But Nora realizes the entire marriage was a sham. She sits him down, pries open the hypocrisy of their bourgeois existence, and says she is leaving him and the children to find out who she actually is, and she walks out. She slams the door.
That door slam was heard around the world. It was a structural betrayal of the well-made play, which is why it was so deeply shocking. The audience came for comfort, and they were handed a bomb.
They used the comfortable form to smuggle in deeply uncomfortable questions about society, marriage, patriarchy, and class. Realism used the architecture of the middle class to burn down the house.
So while realism was busy tearing down the facades of the middle class, using their own theatrical structures against them, another theatrical movement was brewing, and they looked at realism, even brilliant radical realism like Ibsen's, and decided that reality itself was a facade.
We are talking about the avant-garde. For the avant-garde artists, realism was fundamentally flawed because it was too neat.
Even with the door slams.
Even with Ibsen's door slams, the avant-garde believed that the linear, logical cause-and-effect structure of realism failed to capture the true nature of human existence.
Because the human mind isn't a well-made play. The human mind is messy.
Precisely. The avant-garde believed that if you want to find the truth, you can't look at the surface of a living room. You have to look underneath. They embraced fragmentation, dreamscapes, the subconscious, and the esoteric to discover a truer, deeper self that was being crushed by modernity.
I want to pivot here because these movements, realism, the avant-garde, they didn't just happen in abstract academic vacuums. They crashed into real-world politics. And the material we are studying gives us an incredible case study of how these different theatrical styles collided with cultural myth in one specific place. And that place is Ireland at the turn of the 20th century.
Irish theater during this period is a fascinating high-stakes laboratory. You have drama actively grappling with real-world political identity, modernity, and colonialism.
And to understand this, we really have to establish the historical context of Irish anti-colonialism. In the political sphere, and subsequently represented in the literature at the time, there were two dominant approaches to dealing with British rule.
Yes.
And just to be completely clear for our listener, we are looking at how these two very different political approaches were explored within the texts of plays of the time as literary artifacts. We were examining how the stage became the battleground for these ideas entirely neutrally.
Right. The two approaches depicted were the insurrectionist approach, which leaned toward armed rebellion, violent rupture, and breaking away entirely to form an independent republic, and the quietist approach, which focused on constitutional negotiation, parliamentary process, and achieving home rule while maintaining some ties.
And the stage is where this gets hashed out.
The stage became the public square to negotiate these identities. And you had two literary heavyweights approaching this from completely different angles, George Bernard Shaw and W.B. Yeats.
Let's start with Shaw. Shaw is the ultimate rationalist in this debate.
Shaw was a rationalist, an intellectual, and a Fabian socialist.
ELI 5, Fabian socialist.
The Fabian Society was a British socialist organization that believed in advancing socialism through gradualist and reformist means rather than through revolutionary overthrow. They believed in education, debate, and passing laws, not building barricades.
Makes sense.
So Shaw approaches the Irish question with that same rational, analytical mindset. In his play John Bull's Other Island from 1904, he uses comedy and satire to dismantle what was known as the stage Irishman.
The stage Irishman. This is such a crucial concept for understanding colonial theater. What exactly is that trope?
The stage Irishman was a theatrical stereotype. It's the bumbling, charming, hard-drinking, quick-tempered, slightly foolish caricature of an Irish person. Crucially, this stereotype was largely created by and for English audiences.
Why? What purpose did it serve?
It was a comfortable myth. It allowed the British colonizer to feel a sense of patronizing affection and inherent superiority, stripping the colonized subject of their complex humanity and political agency.
It's hard to oppress a complex human equal, but it's very easy to manage a charming, bumbling child.
Exactly. So Shaw puts an English character on stage, a liberal named Broadbent, who completely falls for a fake theatrical Irishman named Tim Haffigan.
Oh, that's sour.
Very. Shaw is using rational satire to expose the hypocrisy and the absurdity of colonial relations. He's saying to the audience, look at how ridiculous your stereotypes are. Look at how they prevent actual progress.
But W.B. Yeats takes a completely different path. He looks at Shaw's rational satire and essentially says, satire isn't enough. Yeats doesn't want to just mock the oppressor's myth. He wants to build a new, powerful myth for the oppressed.
Yeats, along with his collaborator Lady Gregory, leaned heavily into utopianism and cultural myth. They believed that to throw off colonial rule, you couldn't just argue in Parliament. You needed a spiritual and cultural renaissance.
Reclaiming identity.
You had to awaken the soul of the nation and reclaim a deep, mystical authenticity. And this leads to their famous 1902 play, Kathleen Ni Houlihan.
This is one of the most incredible anecdotes in our historical study. So let's break down the play. Kathleen Ni Houlihan is a one-act allegorical play. It is set in 1798, right before the Irish Rebellion.
Right.
A family is preparing for their son's wedding. Suddenly, an old woman enters their home. She is the physical personification of Ireland itself, Kathleen Ni Houlihan. And she tells the family that strangers have taken her 4 beautiful green fields representing the 4 provinces of Ireland.
The imagery is so direct.
Yeah, and she calls on the young groom to abandon his bride, sacrifice himself, and come fight for her to drive the strangers out. And he does. He leaves to join the rebellion, and as he leaves, the old woman is transformed into a young queen with the walk of a queen.
It is pure, potent, emotional allegory. It bypasses the intellect and goes straight for the gut. And Lady Gregory records an extraordinary historical moment. George Bernard Shaw, the supreme rationalist, the Fabian socialist who believed in slow, deliberate parliamentary reform, went to see a performance of this play in London in 1909.
And Shaw was so viscerally moved by this performance that he later wrote, it made him feel it might lead a man to do something foolish. Even the great rationalist felt the gravitational pull of the myth.
He couldn't resist the libidinous physicality and the emotional power of the performance. The allegory transcended his rational thought.
Which is saying something for Shaw.
Absolutely. And the impact of this play on the Irish psyche was so profound that years later, in 1938, after the bloody 1916 Easter Rising and the War of Independence, Yeats famously wondered in his poem, The Man and the Echo, did that play of mine send out certain men the British shot?
Did that play of mine send out certain men the British shot? That gives me chills every time I hear it. The immense weight of realizing your art might have spilled actual blood.
It perfectly illustrates how drama acts as a mythos. For the oppressor, the stage stereotype justifies domination. But for the oppressed, the stage becomes a place where utopian desires, born from suffering, become powerful historical actors in their own right. A play can literally inspire a revolution by reshaping a nation's imagination.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. If we look at this from a bird's eye view, does this mean the avant-garde, with all its fragmented dreamscapes and subconscious exploration, was actually less effective at changing the world than plays rooted in cultural myth?
That's a great question.
If you want to start a revolution, do you write a weird, abstract play about the subconscious, or do you write a compelling, emotional, cultural allegory like Kathleen E. Julian?
That is the eternal debate of political theater. The avant-garde disrupts how we think. It shatters our perception of reality, but cultural myth mobilizes how we feel. It gives us a narrative to belong to. And history suggests that profound shared feeling often drives people to the barricades much faster than intellectual disruption.
And speaking of driving people to the barricades, this immense power of the stage to challenge the state, to cause uproar, kind of lay dormant in polite English society for a few decades, the English theater went to sleep until a very specific night in 1956 changed everything.
To understand the shock of 1956, you have to picture what British theater looked like in the 1940s and early 50s. It was, quite frankly, a wasteland of politeness.
Oh, wasteland of politeness. I like that.
It was completely homogenized. You had an endless parade of upper-middle-class drawing room comedies and verse dramas. The famous theater critic Kenneth Tynan joked that to be eligible for dramatic treatment on the English stage in those days, you either needed an annual income of £3,000 or you needed to be murdered in the house of someone who did.
Anyone for tennis. That was the entire vibe. Just stockbrokers in Surrey, standing around French windows holding teacups, speaking in clipped aristocratic accents. The theater was completely detached from the reality of post-war Britain, which was rationing food and dealing with a crumbling empire.
Exactly. The theater was a safe haven for the upper middle class to ignore reality. And then comes May 8th, 1956. The Royal Court Theatre in London premieres a play by a young, unknown writer named John Osborne. The play is called Look Back in Anger.
Enter Jimmy Porter, the original angry young man.
Huh.
Who was Jimmy Porter, and why did he cause such an earthquake?
Jimmy Porter is the protagonist of the play. He is a highly educated, working-class young man who runs a sweet stall. He lives in a cramped, dingy, one-room flat in the Midlands with his upper-middle-class wife, Allison, and his friend, Cliff.
So, no French windows.
Definitely no French windows. And for 3 acts, Jimmy essentially just rages. He delivers these blistering, cruel, incredibly articulate monologues attacking the complacency of the British establishment, the hypocrisy of his wife's family, the church, the state, and the dead-end reality of life in Britain for someone of his class.
The thing that always strikes me about Look Back in Anger is that structurally, it's not revolutionary at all.
Yeah.
Osborne himself later admitted it was essentially a screevy and well-made play.
Right.
But it wasn't the structure that shocked people, was it? It was the scenery.
It was the scenery, and it was the volume. When the curtain went up, audiences didn't see a drawing room. They saw a cramped, miserable flat with an ironing board in the middle of the room. Allison stands there ironing clothes while Jimmy screams at her. It birthed the term kitchen sink drama.
Because it literally showed the kitchen sink.
It proved that working class life, with all its dirt and frustration, was worthy of the main stage.
It proved you didn't need a drawing room to have a drama. You could have an ironing board. And Jimmy Porter's sheer, unadulterated anger kicked off the angry young men movement. It recaptured the stage as a vehicle for intense feeling and genuine class debate. It punched a hole right through the polite English facade.
And this breakthrough paved the way for an incredible explosion of explicitly political theater in Britain throughout the 1970s. The 70s saw the rise of what were called State of the Nation plays, or, considering the political turmoil of the era, perhaps more accurately, state of emergency plays.
Who were the architects of this movement?
You had brilliant playwrights like David Hare, Howard Brenton, and David Edgar. They were writing massive, epic plays that analyzed the decline of the British nation. They were looking at the intense ideological clashes of the era.
The failures of the post-war consensus, the splintering of radical political factions, the strikes, and the emerging conservative ideologies that would eventually culminate in the 1980s.
Yes, and what strikes me about these plays is the sheer scale of them. These weren't little fringe shows in a basement. These were big, public, theatrical events addressing the nation.
Right.
They were massive. They had large casts of 20 or 30 actors, sweeping historical timelines that jumped across decades, and they were being performed on the major subsidized stages of the country, like the National Theater and the Royal Shakespeare Company. They believed that theater could actually anatomize the nation and explain the vast historical forces at play.
But by the 1980s, the landscape changed again. The State of the Nation play almost disappeared. And it wasn't because the playwrights ran out of ideas or because the politicians successfully banned them. It was because of economics.
The money ran out.
It always comes down to money.
The 1980s saw significant shifts in economic policy, resulting in massive cuts in government art subsidies. Theaters were suddenly put under immense financial pressure to survive in a free market environment. And when a theater is struggling to keep the lights on, the first thing they look at is the budget of the production.
If I'm a theater director trying to balance the books, I can't afford to pay 30 actors to put on a sweeping political epic.
Exactly. Suddenly, theaters could no longer afford the large cast, multi-location plays of the 70s. Economics forced a retreat. If you wanted to get your play produced in the 80s, you couldn't write a play about the clash of national ideologies. You had to write a play with 3 actors, set in a single room.
So what does this all mean? I'm hung up on this point. Did economics successfully censor political theater in a way that critics and politicians couldn't? Is the size of a cast directly proportional to the size of the play's political ambition?
It's a sobering thought, and many playwrights felt exactly that way. The playwright David Edgar noted at the time that the great tradition of analyzing the nation's decline was in danger of extinction, simply because social issues tend to require larger casts than personal subjects.
You can't show a clash of social classes with only 2 people in a room.
You end up defaulting to psychological, private dramas. The grand, unified political narratives of the 1970s broke down, fractured by the reality of a budget sheet.
It's fascinating how the physical constraints of a budget dictate the philosophical scope of the art. And as those grand unified narratives of the 70s broke down, the stage gave way to an era that rejected the idea of unity entirely. The mirror shatters into a million pieces. Which brings us to postmodernism.
Postmodern drama, roughly spanning from 1960 to the year 2000, is incredibly difficult to define because its entire goal is to evade definition.
Naturally.
But it is generally characterized by its irreverence. It's an era of bricolage, which means constructing art from a diverse range of available things, throwing odds and ends together. It heavily utilizes pastiche, imitating the styles of the past, not out of respect, but out of playfulness.
It's a mashup.
Right. It fundamentally rejects the boundaries between high art and low art, and it harbors a deep fundamental skepticism toward any claim of universal truth or overarching historical narrative.
Okay, I want to make this concrete because postmodernism is a word that gets thrown around a lot. Our study guide offers a really brilliant age-wise comparison to understand this shift, using the concept of the stranger.
Yes, let's look at that.
If we look at modernism first, we can look at Tennessee Williams. In A Streetcar Named Desire from 1947, Blanche Dubois has that iconic, heartbreaking line at the end of the play as she is being led away to an asylum. I've always depended on the kindness of strangers.
Let's analyze that line. In the context of modernism, that line represents a search for deep, profound social connection. Blanche's reliance on strangers points to a broader social reality about isolation and vulnerability. Even in her complete despair and mental breakdown, there is a utopian hope embedded in that phrase. A hope for humanity, for grace, for truth. There is immense depth to her tragedy. The words matter.
But then you jump forward a few decades to Harold Pinter in the postmodern era. In his 1965 play The Homecoming, the character Ruth is leaving her husband's family, a family of aggressive, manipulative men. And as she leaves, she says to her brother-in-law simply, "Don't become a stranger."
And the difference is staggering. Pinter's use of the phrase is completely flat. It is dripping with irony. It is entirely depthless.
There's no hope in it.
None. Ruth isn't desperately searching for universal human connection like Blanche. She is using a cynical, superficial social pleasantry to mask base desires and establish dominance. There is no underlying utopian hope. The phrase is just an empty cliche floating in the air.
To visualize this difference between depth and flatness, there is an amazing analogy from the cultural theorist Frederick Jameson. He compares the shift from modernism to postmodernism using 2 famous paintings.
Yes, Jameson compares modernism to Vincent van Gogh's painting, A Pair of Boots. You look at that painting of worn, dirty peasant boots, and they point to a broader social reality.
You can feel the hard agricultural work.
You can feel the poverty, the connection to the earth, the suffering of the peasant. The painting has depth, it demands interpretation. But postmodernism is like Andy Warhol's painting diamond dust shoes.
Which is just a stark, glamorous image of high heels coated in actual diamond dust.
Exactly. Warhol's painting doesn't point to any deeper human struggle or social reality. It is a celebration of superficiality, of flat surfaces, of pure commercialism. It doesn't want you to look through it to find truth. It just wants you to look at it. That flatness, that rejection of hidden depths is the hallmark of postmodern theater.
That flatness is key. Postmodernism plays with history rather than revering it. If history isn't a sacred progression toward truth, then history is just a toy box. And you see this brilliantly in the work of Tom Stoppard. His plays are exercises in philosophical absurdism.
Look at Stoppard's play Travesties from 1974. Stoppard takes the rigid, highly artificial, glittering comedic structure of Oscar Wilde's Victorian play, The Importance of Being Earnest, and he uses it as a container to house historical figures who actually happened to be living in Zurich during World War I.
Right.
He puts the communist revolutionary Vladimir Lenin, the modernist writer James Joyce, and the daddyist artist Tristan Tzara all in the same play, interacting within the framework of a Wildean comedy.
He just mashes them up. He takes the guy who led the Bolshevik Revolution, the guy who wrote Ulysses, and stuffs them into a comedy of manners about cucumber sandwiches.
It's the ultimate collage. Stoppard doesn't treat history as a sacred teleological progression, meaning a straightforward march of time toward a specific destined goal. He treats history as raw material to be juggled for intellectual and comedic effect. It is brilliant, dizzying wordplay.
But postmodernism isn't all just clever wordplay and historical juggling in drawing rooms. It gets incredibly dark. Toward the late 90s, the material highlights what is called the new nihilism of playwrights like Sarah Kane and Martin McDonagh.
Yes, the 1990s in Britain became known for in-your-face theater. This brought an influx of plays featuring extreme violence, sexual brutality, and cruelty. But it's crucial to understand why. For playwrights like Kane and McDonagh, this violence wasn't just a gimmick for cheap sensation. It was a Dionysian rejection of rational restraint.
A Dionysian rejection. Break that down for me. Apollo versus Dionysus.
In Greek mythology, Apollo represents order, logic, reason, and neat boundaries. Scribe's well-made play is very Apollonian. Dionysus is the god of wine, chaos, ecstasy, and visceral, uncontrolled feeling.
Okay, so total chaos.
The new nihilists looked at the postmodern world, a world of flat surfaces, corporate commercialism, and empty political rhetoric, and felt that it was suffocatingly artificial. Their extreme violence on stage was a Dionysian attempt to smash through that artificiality. They were seeking pure, visceral, emotional honesty. They figured that if they couldn't find truth in politics or religion, they could at least find an undeniable reality in physical pain and extreme shock.
What's fascinating here is that despite the extreme violence, the severed limbs, the chaos, postmodernism is actually in mourning.
It is mourning the loss of meaning. The grand narratives of religion, of scientific progress saving us, of unified political utopias, they all collapsed in the 20th century. But unlike modernism, which mourned the loss of meaning through existential tragedy and angst, think of Arthur Miller's Willy Loman crying out for respect in Death of a Salesman. Postmodernism mourns through dark, absurd comedy.
It laughs at the void.
Exactly. It transforms the abyssal dread of the 20th century into a sort of grotesque human comedy. If everything is truly meaningless, you might as well laugh at the horrific absurdity of it all.
But I keep coming back to this. Does that make it fundamentally cynical? If everything is a pastiche, a joke, and we're just playing around in the ruins of history, does theater lose its ability to make us deeply care? Or does it just change how we care?
I think it radically changes how we care. It removes the comfort of sentimentality. When Sarah Kane has a character in her play cleansed say, "Don't make me lie to you," amidst a landscape of horrific, surreal, institutional torture, the plea for simple honesty becomes even more romantically desperate, precisely because of the utter cynicism and violence surrounding it. The care is still there. It's just been stripped of any polite illusions. It's love found at the bottom of a very dark well.
This entire journey, from the polite illusions and political maneuvers of the Renaissance to the brutal, chaotic honesty of the 90s, brings us to a massive, overarching theoretical question that spans all these ages. It's the question of what exactly we are studying when we study drama. What exactly is a play? Is it a piece of literature bound in a book? Or is it an event that happens in a room with an audience?
The page versus stage debate. This is perhaps the most fundamental tension in the academic study of drama. And the tension really begins with a technological revolution, the invention of the printing press.
Because before the printing press, a play was just an event.
Exactly. Before mass printing, plays were essentially just scripts working documents written by hand, heavily annotated, and used exclusively by actors to memorize their lines. They weren't meant for public consumption, but once plays could be printed, bound, and sold like the famous Shakespeare folios, they transformed.
They became readable.
They stopped being just working blueprints and became literature. They became static objects to be read by a single person in a quiet room, rather than dynamic events to be experienced collectively in a noisy theater.
And this literature approach didn't just casually catch on, it became heavily institutionalized by academia. In the 1940s and 50s, you had a dominant school of literary criticism known as the New Critics, led by scholars like Cleanth Brooks and Robert Heilman.
The new critics argued that drama should be judged purely as literature on a page. They actively suppressed and ignored the theatrical elements of a play.
Why suppress the stage? What were they afraid of?
They were afraid of unpredictability. For the new critics, a text was a perfect, self-contained urn of meaning. You analyze the metaphors, the meter, the poetry, but the physical stage is messy. Actors forget lines, they put weird inflections on words, a lighting cue happens late, the audience coughs.
Humans mess it up.
The new critics considered things like stage design, the actors' physical movements, and the costumes to be secondary distractions from the pure poetry of the text. They believed the text held all the inherent meaning, and the stage was merely a flawed vehicle for technical reproduction.
But if we look historically, that view of the text as a sacred, unalterable artifact just doesn't hold up, right? Texts were incredibly fluid. You mentioned the printing press, but even after things were printed, the stage dictated what the text was. Let's talk about Nahum Tate.
Nahum Tate's version of King Lear is the ultimate proof that texts were fluid. In 1687, Tate looked at Shakespeare's King Lear, which ends with the heartbreaking, miserable deaths of King Lear and his loyal daughter Cordelia, and decided it was simply too depressing for modern audiences. So he rewrote it. He gave it a happy ending.
He just fixed Shakespeare.
He did. In Tate's version, Cordelia doesn't die. She survives and marries Edgar. Lear survives and retires peacefully. And the astonishing thing isn't just that he wrote it. The astonishing thing is that Tate's happy ending version survived as the dominant, exclusively performed version of the play on the English stage for over a century.
150 years of audiences thinking King Lear was a romance with a happy ending.
Yes. It proves that historically, dramatic texts were not viewed by theater makers as sacred, unalterable literary urns. They were viewed as adaptable raw material. The text was always subject to the changing tastes, moralities, and technologies of the stage.
So if the new critics were wrong to ignore the stage, but we still need the text to perform the play, how do we reconcile the two? How do we balance the page and the stage?
We can look to the brilliant 20th century theorist Kenneth Burke. Burke offered a solution by changing the metaphor. He argued that a script is not a score like sheet music, and it is not a blueprint like an architectural drawing. Both of those metaphors imply a rigid, faithful reproduction of an original, perfect design. If you don't follow the blueprint exactly, the building falls down.
So what is a script if not a blueprint?
Burke said a script is an agency or a tool. It is an instrument that is picked up and used within the specific scene of a theater. A hammer is a tool, but it does different things depending on who swings it and what they are hitting.
So the play is the dialectic, the conversation between the poetry, the archive of the text that survives through history, and the performance, the repertoire of the living actors in the moment.
Exactly. Every time a text is enacted in a new scene, with new actors for a new audience, it performs a completely new act. The words might be identical to what Shakespeare wrote 400 years ago, but the deed that those words accomplish in a theater in 2026 is entirely different.
If that's the case, I'm thinking about our education system. If reading a play is like staring at a hammer instead of watching someone build a house, why do we force high schoolers to read Shakespeare silently at desks instead of acting it out? Have we completely misunderstood what dramatic writing is actually meant to be?
We have certainly allowed the convenience of the printing press and the ease of grading a written essay to override the communal nature of the art form. The text is the tool, but the performance is the work. To truly understand drama, you have to see the tool in motion.
Well, we have covered an incredible amount of ground today. Thank you to everyone for joining us on this massive historical deep dive. What we've realized today is that drama, is the ultimate malleable technology. It's a mirror that constantly shifts its shape, its tint, and its angle to reflect the specific anxieties, the economic constraints, and the shifting philosophies of its age. From a mirror reflecting the grand cosmic and political order of the Renaissance, to a microscope dissecting the grim class struggles of realism, to a shattered funhouse glass reflecting the depthless pastiche and dark comedy of postmodernism.
It is a technology of empathy and exposure, and for centuries it has been entirely dependent on human bodies gathering in a shared physical space to experience it together.
And I want to leave you with a thought to mull over as we wrap up. We've traced drama from the wooden, open-air stages of the Globe Theater in the Renaissance to the postmodern black box theaters of the late 20th century. But today, we are entering an entirely new technological age, an age of augmented reality, of deepfakes, of virtual avatars and infinite digital realms. For many of us, our online personas, our social media feeds, our virtual avatars are our daily performances. If all the world is a stage was the motto of the Renaissance, what happens to drama when the stage goes completely digital? Will the next great theatrical revolution happen in a physical building at all, or will it happen in the virtual spaces where we now live so much of our lives? Keep exploring these ideas. Take a look at the stages you step onto every day, both physical and digital. Thanks for taking this deep dive.